The air on the 48th floor of the Sterling Vance building doesn't circulate so much as it settles. It is filtered through a 3-stage hospital-grade ionization system and scented with a bespoke fragrance that smells like rain-drenched sandalwood and unearned confidence. In the fintech world, this is the scent of a unicorn. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, watching the fog roll over the Hudson, my reflection a faint, nondescript ghost against the backdrop of the New York skyline. Behind me, the launch party for Aegis, our supposed revolutionary payment architecture, was in full swing. It was a symphony of clinking baccarat crystal, the low thrum of proprietary algorithms, and the high-pitched laughter of people who haven't checked their own bank accounts in a decade. Julian Vane, our senior VP of product, was at the center of the orbit. Julian is a man designed by a committee to look like success. His suit was a midnight blue charcoal that cost more than a mid-size sedan, and his hair had that precise level of calculated disarray that suggests he's too busy changing the world to use a comb, yet he clearly spent 40 minutes in front of a mirror to achieve it. He was holding court with the lead investors from Blackwood Equity, gesturing wildly toward the massive OLED screen displaying a live heat map of our global transaction flow. Efficiency is a legacy metric, Julian's voice carried over the room, smooth and authoritative. Aegis isn't just about speed, it's about the democratization of liquidity. We've removed the friction, we've removed the human error. What you're seeing is a perfect machine. I watched the screen. The heat map was glowing a soft, reassuring green. To the investors, it looked like a garden of profit. To me, it looked like a dying star, beautiful, bright, and seconds away from a gravitational collapse. I've spent 3 years as the lead systems architect at Sterling Vance. In Julian's world, that makes me the plumber. I'm the person who crawls through the digital sewers to make sure his shiny gold faucets actually run water. For 6 months, I had submitted reports regarding the shadow latency building in the core ledger. I had requested 3 weeks of downtime to refactor the legacy code Julian had insisted we wrap instead of replace to save time for the Series C funding round. My reports were never read. My emails were archived in a folder labeled Technical Debt Low Priority. In Julian's lexicon, technical debt was just a ghost story told by people who weren't disruptive enough. I adjusted my glasses and stepped away from the window, moving toward the buffet. I wasn't looking for food, I was looking for the exit. But Julian spotted me. He needed a prop for his next performance. "Arthur!" His voice cut through the ambient jazz. He didn't wait for me to approach, he simply beckoned with 2 fingers, the way one might call a stray dog in a park. I walked over, my movements deliberate and quiet. The investors, 3 men in identical gray suits, and a woman with a face as sharp as a razor blade, turned to look at me. Their eyes didn't linger on my face, they scanned my attire, a standard-issue gray sweater and chinos, and immediately categorized me as non-essential. "Julian," I said, my voice flat. "Julian is one of our code monkeys," Julian said, throwing a heavy arm over my shoulder. The smell of his expensive cologne was suffocating. "He keeps the lights on while we do the thinking. Tell them, Arthur, isn't Aegis the most robust architecture you've ever worked on?" The room went quiet. Julian's grip on my shoulder tightened slightly, a warning. He didn't want an honest answer. He wanted a testimonial. He wanted the quiet guy to validate his genius so he could close the $50 million expansion deal currently sitting on the mahogany table in the corner. I looked at the screen. A tiny flicker of yellow appeared on the map near the London hub. Most people would miss it. I didn't. That was the first domino. The ledger was starting to desynchronize. The perfect machine was beginning to eat itself. "It's certainly unique," The way it handles high-volume concurrency is unprecedented. Julian laughed, a sharp barking sound. See? Unprecedented. Even the skeptics are impressed. He turned back to the investors, effectively erasing me from the conversation without moving a muscle. Now, about the exit strategy for the Q3 dividends. Julian, I interrupted. The silence that followed was heavy. You don't interrupt Julian when he's talking about exit strategies. He turned his head slowly, his smile still present, but his eyes turning into two pieces of flint. Yes, Arthur? Did you forget to refill the espresso machine? The investors chuckled. It was a practiced, cruel sound. The woman with the razor blade face looked at her watch. I was a glitch in their evening. The London hub just dropped 4 milliseconds in response time. That's a sign of a buffer overflow in the core API. If we don't switch to the secondary failsafe in the next 5 minutes, the entire ledger will desync. The transactions won't just stop, they'll double count. We'll be hemorrhaging capital into a black hole. Julian's smile didn't falter, but a small vein began to throb in his temple. He leaned in closer, his voice a low, dangerous whisper that only I could hear. Listen to me, you little gremlin. I don't care if the servers are literally on fire. You are going to go back to your desk, you are going to sit there, and you are going to stay out of my light. I am 5 minutes away from signing a deal that will make this company the dominant force in the Atlantic. Do you think these people care about buffer overflows? They care about optics. And right now, your optics are disgusting. Get out, now. He pulled away, his voice returning to its booming, charismatic pitch. Apologies, everyone. Arthur gets a bit twitchy around crowds. Too much time staring at blue light, I suppose. Why don't you head down to the basement, Artie? I think there's a ham sandwich in the break room with your name on it. He didn't just dismiss me. He gutted my professional standing in front of the only people whose opinions he valued. He treated me like a nuisance, a janitor who had accidentally wandered into a state dinner. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the arrogance, the shallow understanding of the very system he claimed to have built, and the utter lack of respect for the foundation I had laid. Of course, Julian, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. I'll leave you to your optics. I turned and walked toward the elevator. As the doors began to slide shut, I looked back at the OLED screen. The yellow flicker in London had turned orange. A second flicker appeared in Tokyo, then Frankfurt. Julian was laughing, his hand already reaching for the Mont Blanc pen on the mahogany table. He had no idea that I hadn't just predicted the collapse, I had stopped preventing it. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened a terminal emulator and typed a single command. It didn't break anything, it simply removed the manual overrides I had been running for the last 3 months to keep his perfect machine from exploding. I was no longer the plumber, I was just a spectator. The elevator chimed as it reached the lobby. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was an automated alert. Critical system failure, Aegis, core ledger. Data integrity, 0. The show was about to start. I walked out into the cool night air of Manhattan, found a bench across the street, and sat down. I looked up at the 48th floor. In exactly 60 seconds, every light in that room was going to change color, and Julian Vane was about to find out exactly what happens when you ignore the man who built the floor you're standing on. For 3 minutes, the 48th floor remained a silhouette of golden light against the darkening sky. Then it happened. From my vantage point on the park bench, I saw the shift. The warm amber glow of the party was punctuated by a harsh, rhythmic strobing of red. The emergency server alerts reflected against the glass. In the high-stakes world of fintech, silence is the loudest sound you'll ever hear. It's the sound of billions of dollars in liquidity evaporating into the ether because of a misplaced semicolon or an unhandled exception. I checked my watch, right on time. I stood up, smoothed my chinos, and walked back toward the revolving doors. The lobby was already a hive of controlled panic. Security guards were speaking rapidly into their lapels. Black SUVs with tinted windows were pulling up to the curb, disgorging men and women in dark overcoats who moved with the predatory grace of federal regulators or insolvency lawyers. I didn't use my employee badge. I didn't need to. I walked toward the private elevator bank, the one reserved for board members and majority shareholders. Standing there was a man named Elias Thorne. Thorne is a vulture in the most clinical sense of the word. He doesn't build companies, he waits for them to bleed out so he can harvest the organs. He looked at me, his eyes two cold chips of Icelandic ice, and nodded once. "The ledger poisoned?" he asked. His voice was like dry parchment. "Total desynchronization," I replied. "The Aegis architecture is currently double-counting every transaction from the last 12 minutes. By the time they hard reset the servers, the delta between their reported assets and their actual cash on hand will be roughly $400 million. Possibly more depending on how much the London hub tried to autocorrect. Fiduciary negligence on a grand scale," Thorne remarked, pressing the button for the 48th floor. "Julian Vane really did hand us the keys on a silver platter, didn't he?" "He was too busy looking at the platter to notice the keys," I said. The elevator climbed in a pressurized silence. When the doors opened, the sandalwood scent was gone, replaced by the ozone smell of overworked cooling fans and the sour tang of human sweat. The jazz had stopped. The Baccarat crystals sat abandoned on side tables, the champagne going flat. Julian was standing in front of the OLED screen, which was now a chaotic tapestry of crimson error codes. The heat map was replaced by a scrolling log of reconciliation failures. He was shouting into a phone, his midnight blue suit jacket discarded on the floor, his expensive shirt damp at the armpits. "I don't care about the protocols. Route the traffic through the Jersey backup," Julian screamed. He turned, seeing the investors huddled in a corner like sheep sensing a wolf. "It's a glitch, a minor synchronization lag. We're on top of it." Then he saw me, and more importantly, he saw Elias Thorne standing behind me. Julian's face went through a fascinating series of transitions: confusion, recognition, and finally, a pale, sickly realization. He dropped the phone. It clattered against the hardwood floor, a small plastic death rattle. "Elias," Julian stammered, stepping forward, his hands out as if to physically stop the momentum of the room. "What are you doing here? This is a private launch. We're just navigating a small technical hurdle." Thorne didn't look at the screen. He looked at Julian with the same interest a biologist might show a failing lab specimen. "The hurdle is 6 feet high and made of concrete, Julian. I'm here because as of 3 minutes ago, Blackwood Equity has invoked the systemic failure clause in the Series C debt covenant. You've breached your fiduciary duty. The collateral, this company, its IP, and its remaining liquidity has been transferred to my firm for immediate restructuring." Julian's eyes darted to me, his pupils blown wide. "Arthur, what is this? What did you tell him?" "I didn't tell him anything he couldn't see for himself, Julian." I walked toward the central console. "I didn't rush. I had all the time in the world now. I sent the board a risk assessment memo 4 months ago. It was detailed, mathematically sound, and utterly ignored by your office. I simply made sure Elias had a copy of that memo before he signed the bridge loan last month." The investors, The gray-suited wolves from earlier were now looking at Julian with a loathing that was almost physical. The woman with the razor blade face stepped forward, her voice a whip crack. "You told us the architecture was robust, Julian. You told us the lead architect," she glanced at me, her eyes narrowing, "was fully aligned with the launch timeline." "He is! He was!" Julian shouted, his voice cracking. He lunged toward me, grabbing the edge of the console. "Arthur, fix it, right now. I'll give you whatever you want. 0.5% of the carry, a partner title. Just get the ledger back in sync before the press gets wind of this." I looked down at his hands, the manicured nails, the $5,000 watch. They were shaking. "The ledger isn't broken, Julian," I said softly, loud enough for him to hear. "It's performing exactly how you demanded it should. You wanted frictionless liquidity. You wanted a system that didn't ask questions. Well, here it is. It's so frictionless that the money is just sliding away." "Fix it," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "I am doing my job," I replied. I reached out and gently unpeeled his fingers from the console. "But I don't work for you anymore. I work for the new majority stakeholder, and my first recommendation to him was a total audit of the executive leadership's competence." I turned back to the screen and typed in a series of commands, not to fix the system, it was far past that, but to preserve the evidence of the collapse. I locked the admin logs, encrypted the communication history between my desk and Julian's office, and triggered a snapshot of the current debt-to-equity ratio. The room felt like it was shrinking. The arrogance that had fueled the evening had been sucked out, leaving a vacuum of pure, cold liability. Julian looked around at the investors, then at Thorne, and finally at the code monkey who was now holding the digital leash of his entire career. "You can't do this," Julian whispered, though the bravado was gone. He looked small. "This is my vision." "A vision is just a hallucination until you build the foundation," I said, leaning back against the desk. "You built a palace on a swamp and then insulted the man who told you the tide was coming in." I looked at Elias Thorne. "The system is stabilized for forensic review. The hemorrhaging has stopped, but the patient is brain dead. We can begin the liquidation of the executive assets immediately." Julian slumped into a chair, the same chair where 30 minutes ago he had planned to sign a deal that would make him a billionaire. He looked at the ham sandwich sitting on a nearby plate, the one he'd joked about earlier. It looked dry, pathetic. The tide hadn't just come in, it had swept the entire 48th floor out to sea, and I was the only one who knew how to swim. The Monday morning after a systemic collapse is the quietest time in the world. The adrenaline of the crisis has evaporated, leaving only the cold, hard math of the aftermath. At 8 a.m., the Sterling Vance lobby wasn't filled with the usual parade of mid-level aspirants wearing Patagonia vests and clutching overpriced lattes. Instead, there were men in charcoal suits carrying forensic laptops and rolling document crates. I sat in Julian's former office, a space designed more as a cathedral to his ego than a place of work. The desk was a slab of rare Makassar ebony that felt like an altar. I didn't sit in the executive chair. I sat on the edge of the desk, reviewing the burn list with Elias Thorne. "The board has ratified your appointment as interim chief operating officer," Thorne said, not looking up from his tablet. "You have total discretionary authority over the restructuring. My firm wants the waste cut. We want the rot cauterized." "We're not just cutting waste, Elias," I said, my voice steady. "We're performing an organ transplant. The culture of this company was built on the idea that the loudest voice in the room is the most valuable. That ends today. The radical reform began at 9 a.m. In the fintech world, this is known as a day zero event. I didn't send a mass email. I didn't hold a town hall. I simply had the security team revoke the credentials of the entire upper-tier product management floor. 24 people, all of them Julian's hand-picked evangelists, found their key cards dead. They were ushered to a side conference room where severance packages, stripped of their performance bonuses due to the gross negligence clause I'd quietly inserted into the revised bylaws weeks prior, were waiting. In their place, I called up the basement. The junior engineers, the QA testers, the quiet analysts who had spent years shouting into the void of Julian's indifference. They entered the executive floor with a mix of terror and confusion. "Sit," I told them, gesturing to the Herman Miller chairs that cost more than their monthly rent. "You're not here to disrupt or pivot. You're here to refactor. The Aegis core is dead. We are reverting to the 2.4 legacy build, optimizing the concurrency layers, and we are not going home until the ledger balances to the 8th decimal point. From now on, your value is not measured by your vision, it's measured by your uptime." I watched them work. For the first time in years, the 48th floor sounded like a real company. No jazz, no clinking glasses, just the rhythmic, beautiful clicking of mechanical keyboards. Then came the final task. Julian was in the holding area, waiting for his formal exit interview. He hadn't been allowed to return to his office. He sat in a small, glass-walled breakout room, looking like a man who had survived a plane crash only to realize he'd lost his luggage. His suit was wrinkled. His hair, for once, was truly a mess. I walked in and closed the door. I didn't sit down. "Arthur," he said, his voice a ghost of its former resonance. He tried to muster a smile, but it looked more like a grimace. "I've been talking to my lawyers. This systemic failure move is a bit aggressive, don't you think? We can settle this. I can go to the press, tell them I'm stepping down to pursue other ventures. It protects the stock price. It protects you." "The stock price is already in the basement, Julian," I said, leaning against the glass. "And I don't need protection. I have the logs." I placed a single sheet of paper on the table. It was a printout of the email he sent me 3 months ago, the one where he told me to stop whining about technical debt and focus on the UI. "You ignored the quietest person in the company because you thought silence was a sign of weakness. You thought my job was to make your lies look like truths. But the thing about reality is that it doesn't care about your optics. Code doesn't have an ego. A ledger doesn't care about your charismatic leadership. It's binary. It works or it doesn't." Julian looked at the paper, then back at me. "What do you want, Arthur? You've already taken my company. You've taken my reputation. What's left?" "I want you to understand the difference between status and worth. You spent your whole life building status. You cultivated the right friends, the right suits, the right scent. You thought that made you indispensable. But worth is what's left when the lights go out. And when the lights went out on Friday night, you were worth exactly 0. I stood up. "The security team will escort you to the service elevator. Your personal items have been couriered to your penthouse. Don't bother calling the board. They've already scrubbed your name from the website." "You're a cold son of a bitch," Julian spat, a flash of his old arrogance flickering in his eyes. "No," I replied, opening the door. "I'm just the plumber, and I've finished fixing the leak." I walked back out into the main workspace. The sun was hitting the Hudson, casting a long, sharp shadow across the floor. My team was working in a focused monastic silence. There was no celebration, there was only the work. We live in a world that worships the architects of the facade. We reward the talkers, the disruptors, and the people who can sell a dream without knowing how to wake up from it. We ignore the people in the shadows, the ones who actually hold the structures together until the moment those structures begin to creak. Status is a performance. It's a costume we wear to convince the world we matter. But worth is the silent foundation. It's the code that runs while the world sleeps. It's the quiet employee who sees the cracks before anyone else. As I looked out over the city, I realized that Julian was right about one thing. It was a perfect machine, but it wasn't the software. It was the realization that in the end, the people who build the world are the only ones who truly own it. I turned back to my monitor and began to type. There was still a lot of debt to clear.